In 1965, a small island nation was kicked out of its own country. No natural resources, no land, no water, not even a proper economy. Its leader wept on national television. 58 years later, that same island has the highest GDP per capita on Earth, one of the lowest crime rates in the world, and more millionaires per capita than any other nation. This is not a story about luck, geography, or oil money. This is a story about one decision, a decision so radical that the entire world assumed it would fail. The rejection. To understand what happened, you need to understand the moment everything changed. On August 9th, 1965, the Parliament of Malaysia voted unanimously to expel Singapore from the Federation. Just 2 years earlier, Singapore had willingly merged with Malaysia, believing that a larger union was the only path to economic survival. Singapore had no hinterland, no natural resources, and a population of less than 2 million people living on an island roughly the size of Chicago. The merger was supposed to solve everything. Instead, it collapsed in racial tension, political conflict, and mutual distrust. On the day of the separation, Singapore's Prime Minister, Kuan Yew, appeared on television. He was not angry. He was not defiant. He broke down. On live national television, the most powerful man in Singapore cried. Not because he was weak, but because he understood. In that moment, the full weight of what had just happened. His country had just been told it was not wanted. The Malaysian Prime Minister Tunku Abdul Rahman called the separation final and irreversible. There would be no reconciliation. Singapore was on its own, and the situation was dire. Singapore had no reliable water supply. Malaysia controlled the pipelines that fed fresh water into the island. Singapore had no army, no significant industry, an unemployment rate approaching 15%, and a population divided along ethnic lines between Chinese, Malay, and Indian communities. The British, who had governed Singapore as a colony for over a century, were in the process of withdrawing their military forces from the region. The protection Singapore had relied on was disappearing. By every conventional measure of nation building, Singapore should not have survived. Most observers at the time gave it months, maybe a few years before it would be absorbed by a larger neighbor or descend into chaos. The decision. Kuan Yew had a choice, and every option available to him was bad. Option 1. Beg Malaysia to take Singapore back. This would mean accepting humiliating terms, political subordination, and the loss of everything Singapore had tried to build. Lee dismissed this immediately. He would not crawl back to a partnership that had already rejected him. Option 2. Align with Indonesia, the massive archipelago to the south. But Indonesia under President Sukarno was openly hostile to Singapore and had already launched a military confrontation with Malaysia. Alignment with Indonesia would mean surrendering sovereignty to a hostile power. Option 3. Appeal to the international community for aid and protection. This was the weakest option of all. Small nations that rely on the charity of larger ones do not determine their own fate. Kuan Yew chose none of these. Instead, he made a decision that seemed absurd on its face. He decided that Singapore would become a global economic power through sheer force of will, policy design, and the systematic attraction of foreign capital. Not through natural resources, not through military strength, not through geographic advantage. Through the deliberate, engineered construction of an environment so attractive to international business that corporations would choose to base their Asian operations in Singapore over every other country in the region. This was not a vague aspiration. It was an engineering project. Lee and his team identified the specific conditions that multinational corporations needed: political stability, rule of law, zero corruption, low taxation, an educated English-speaking workforce, world-class infrastructure, and a government that would actively partner with business rather than obstruct it. They then set out to build every single one of those conditions from scratch on an island that had none of them. The decision was to treat nation building not as a political project, but as a systems engineering problem. And the timeline was not decades. Lee wanted results in years. The speed of the execution is what makes this story extraordinary. Within 3 years of independence, Singapore had created the Economic Development Board, a government agency specifically designed to attract foreign investment. This was not a typical bureaucratic department. It operated more like a high-performance sales team whose only product was Singapore itself. EDB officers were sent to cities around the world: New York, London, Tokyo, Zurich. Their job was to convince CEOs that a tiny island with no resources was the safest and most profitable place to build their Asian headquarters. And they succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. Companies like Texas Instruments, Hewlett-Packard, and National Semiconductor set up manufacturing plants in Singapore in the late 1960s and early 1970s. They came because Lee's government offered something no other Southeast Asian country could: predictability. In a region known for political instability, corruption, and policy whiplash, Singapore offered contracts that were honored, regulations that were transparent, and a government that responded to business needs in days, not years. The anti-corruption framework Lee built was so aggressive that it became a competitive advantage. The Corrupt Practices Investigation Bureau was given extraordinary power to investigate anyone, including ministers. By the 1970s, Singapore was one of the least corrupt countries in Asia, and foreign capital flowed in accordingly. But Lee did not stop at attracting factories. He understood that manufacturing alone would not sustain a wealthy nation. The real money was in finance, logistics, and professional services. So he systematically built the infrastructure for each. The port of Singapore was transformed into the busiest container port in the world. Changi Airport was designed from the ground up to be a global aviation hub. The financial sector was deregulated and modernized, attracting international banks and investment firms. Education was overhauled with a ruthlessly pragmatic focus on English, mathematics, science, and engineering. Lee personally intervened in education policy, insisting that the curriculum served the economy's needs rather than any ideological preference. Every system in Singapore was designed to serve one purpose: make the country indispensable to the global economy. The cost. None of this came without a price. And the price is the part of the story that most YouTube documentaries gloss over. Lee Kuan Yew's Singapore was not a liberal democracy. It was, by his own description, a guided democracy. The government controlled the press, restricted opposition political activity, and maintained strict social order through laws that many Western observers considered authoritarian. Chewing gum was banned. Caning was a legal punishment. Drug trafficking carried a mandatory death penalty. Lee's rationale was consistent and unapologetic. A small, vulnerable nation with no natural buffers could not afford the luxury of instability, even in the name of individual freedom. And here is the uncomfortable truth that makes this story so compelling. The system worked. By every measurable standard of human development, Singapore succeeded. Life expectancy rose from 65 years in 1965 to over 84 years today. The GDP per capita grew from $500 to over $82,000, surpassing the United States, the United Kingdom, and almost every European nation. The crime rate became one of the lowest in the world. The education system produced students who consistently rank among the top globally in mathematics, science, and reading. Housing, which was a crisis in 1965 with hundreds of thousands living in slums, was solved through a public housing program that now houses over 80% of the population. This is the paradox at the heart of Singapore's story. And it is the reason this video exists on the Decision Project. Lee Kuan Yew made a decision that was morally complex, strategically brilliant, and historically transformative. He chose order over freedom, efficiency over democracy, and long-term national survival over short-term political popularity. Whether you agree with his methods or not, the results are undeniable. A swamp became the richest country on earth. Not through oil, not through conquest, not through luck. through a decision. The lesson from Singapore is not that authoritarianism works, nor is it that small countries cannot compete. The lesson is about treating impossible problems as engineering challenges rather than political ones. Lee Kuan Yew did not waste time on ideology. He did not ask what was fair or what was traditional. He asked what was necessary, and then he built the systems to make it happen. If you are building something, the question is not whether your starting position is advantageous. It is whether you can design a system so effective that your starting position becomes irrelevant. Singapore's starting position was the worst imaginable. The system Lee built made it the best imaginable. That is the power of a decision executed without compromise. Every decision creates a ripple. Some change a city. Some change the world. What decision changed your life? Let me know in the comments. If this made you think differently about Singapore, subscribe. Next up, we are looking at the decision that changed the world.